Welcome to my channel and thanks for watching. Living in the countryside had always felt both serene and isolating. The old farmhouse, surrounded by acres of fields and dense woods, was a place where time seemed to stand still. I lived there with my mother and Greg, my stepfather. Greg was a quiet, reserved man, always kind to my mother and me, a calm presence that made the house feel steady. Secure at first, I saw him as just that, a father figure, someone who had come into our lives to fill a void, to make our little family whole again. But over time, things began to change. It started with the way he looked at me, his eyes lingering a moment too long, his smile softening in a way that made my heart beat faster. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. He was my stepfather after all, and he had always treated me with kindness and respect. But the air between us began to shift, the tension growing in a way that I couldn't ignore. I found myself watching him, noticing the way he moved, the way his voice lowered when he spoke to me, and I felt something stir inside me, something I knew I shouldn't feel. One night, my mother had to leave for a work trip, leaving Greg and me alone in the house. The evening was quiet, the air thick with the scent of rain that had just begun to fall outside. We had dinner together, the silence between us comfortable, but charged with something unspoken. Afterward, we sat in the living room, the only light coming from the flickering fire in the hearth. I could feel his eyes on me, the warmth of his gaze making my skin prickle. My heart pound. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the way the firelight danced across his face, or the way his eyes seemed to see right through me. I moved closer, my breath catching in my throat as I reached out, my fingers brushing against his. He looked at me, his eyes darkening, and for a moment I thought he would pull away, that he would tell me this was wrong, that we couldn't do this, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, tentative at first, then deeper, more insistent. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself get lost in him, in the warmth of his touch, the way his breath mingled with mine, the way his body pressed against me. It was reckless, dangerous. But in that moment, I didn't care. I wanted to feel him, to feel alive, in a way I hadn't felt in so long. The world outside disappeared. The only thing that mattered was the fire between us. The way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world. We moved together, our bodies fitting against each other, as if they had always been meant to, and for those few hours nothing else existed. Not the farmhouse, not my mother, not the consequences that loomed over us. It was just us, wrapped in the warmth of each other's arms, the storm outside forgotten. But as the dawn broke, the weight of what we had done settled over me, heavy and inescapable. I pulled away from him, the reality of our actions crashing down on me. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Regret, perhaps. Or maybe just the same fear that had begun to take root inside me. We didn't speak, the silence between us now. Thick, uncomfortable. I left the room, my heart pounding, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened, of what we had done. That was when the strange occurrences began. It started with the animals. The horses in the stable, usually calm and gentle, began to act strangely, their eyes wide with fear, their movements erratic. They would kick at their stalls, their whines echoing through the night, a sound filled with panic. The chickens refused to leave their coop, their feathers ruffled, their eyes darting nervously. Even the dog, always so loyal and brave, would whimper, refusing to go near the old barn. Then there were the sounds at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside was dark. I would hear them, soft whispers coming from the direction of the old barn. I would lie in bed, my heart pounding, listening to the voices that seemed to drift through the walls. Voices that spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their tone, urgent, angry. I tried to ignore them, tried to tell myself that it was just the wind, just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it was something more. One night, I dreamed of her, a woman, her face obscured by shadows, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo through my mind. She stood in the barn, her hands outstretched, her eyes filled with anger, with sorrow you must pay. She whispered, her voice growing louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear, until it filled every corner of my mind. I woke up gasping, my throat tight, the taste of fear bitter on my tongue. I could still feel her presence, the weight of her words pressing down on me, a warning that I couldn't ignore. The following days were worse. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, the voices now seeming to come from within the house itself. I would see things, glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes that would vanish the moment I turned to look. The walls of the house began to change, strange symbols appearing in the wood, symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their meaning unknown, known but unmistakably sinister. Greg, too, was affected. He grew distant, his eyes hollow, his face pale. He spoke little, his once calm demeanor now replaced by a nervousness that I had never seen in him. Before he told me of the dreams of the woman who came to him at night, her eyes filled with anger, her hands cold as she touched him, her voice a whisper that promised retribution. He showed me his hands, the skin red and raw as if burned, and I knew then that whatever we had awakened, it was not going to let us go. One night, I woke to the feeling of something pressing down on my chest, a weight that made it impossible to breathe. I opened my eyes, and there she was, the woman from my dreams. Her face twisted in anger, her hands pressing against my chest, her eyes locked onto mine. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body froze in the air around me, thick with the scent of smoke, of something burning. I could feel her hatred, her need for revenge, and I knew that this was our punishment, that the sins of the past had come back to claim us, that the farmhouse held a darkness that would not rest until it had taken everything from us. The whispers, the symbols, the presence that haunted us, they were all signs, all warnings of the price we had to pay. The bond that had formed between Greg and me, the passion that had once felt so alive, had become a chain that bound us to the past, to the sins that had been committed. Within these walls, long before we had ever set foot in the farmhouse, and as the darkness closed in, as the whispers grew louder, and the air grew colder, I knew that there was no escaping it, that the storm we had created would never pass, that the silence would never return.